There was an unsettling sentence in the 1876 archives of the old county of Blackmarsh, written in the margin of a document that should have been purely administrative. The handwriting was firm, slanted, and even today it is possible to see where the pen trembled before touching the paper. It read, "The forced renunciation began in the attic, and when the sun returned, 17 names no longer belonged on our list of residents." None of the clerks who worked after that year could explain why that note did not follow the standard of official records, nor who exactly had ordered it. But a meticulous analysis, conducted more than 90 years later, revealed something even more disturbing. The handwriting belonged to the county's assistant clerk, Elias Harrow, a man who should never have mixed personal opinion with public reports. Elias Harrow, 41 years old in 1876, was considered a disciplined employee, cordial, meticulous to the point of excess. In his reports, every comma had a purpose, every date, every name, every variation in local weather was written down 3 times. He had grown up in Blackmarsh, the son of small merchants, and knew every family, every barn, every muddy trail that cut through the valley surrounding the village. Thus, when more than 36 documents from that year began to show small inconsistencies, the county first assumed it was an error from the newly hired clerk. However, as comparisons and cross-checks accumulated, it became impossible to deny. The irregularities came from Elias's own hand, and they were not lapses. They were deliberate attempts to conceal gaps. In that late spring, Blackmarsh was an isolated community made up of farmers, freshwater fishermen, and a few families who lived off modest trade with nearby villages. The roads were narrow, marked by wagon tracks, and most community life took place in the central square, where a simple bell tower marked each hour with a dull, dragging chime. The houses, almost all of them wooden, were built close together because of the harsh winters that afflicted the region year after year. To this was added a tradition few outsiders understood well, a silent respect, or a veiled fear, for the widow who lived on the northern hill. They called her only the Blackmarsh widow, though her given name was Margaret Ellery. She was a woman who had lost her husband under unclear circumstances during a snowstorm 3 years earlier. Since then, she lived alone in the oldest house in the village, a structure of dark planks that seemed to have absorbed decades of wind, rain, and poorly told stories. At the top of the house, a long attic with a narrow west-facing window was often mentioned by the villagers, not because of alleged hauntings, but because of the unsettling feeling that someone was always watching the village from up there. In this setting of silence and veiled superstition, Elias Harrow tried to keep Blackmarsh organized through books and numbers. In his notebooks, he described the harvest, the number of formally registered residents, the marriages, the births, and the deaths. But when revisiting the 1876 archives, one sees something only someone familiar with every voice, every routine, every rumor could have done. Entire pages where names had disappeared, replaced by blank spaces. Always 17 names, exactly 17, repeated in different documents as if the village itself had decided to erase them. The introduction to this case begins in June 1876, when the village recorded an unusual influx of temporary visitors, especially travelers seeking safe shelter during that year's heavy rains. The Blackmarsh widow had offered shelter to some of them, according to scattered testimonies, and her attic, the same one mentioned in later notes, seemed to have gained a new purpose, though no one knew exactly which. Official papers mentioned transient guests, without names, ages, or origin. And there, in the gaps of those records, began to appear what local historians would later call the period of forced renunciation. What Elias knew, and what he chose to record so hesitantly, remains a matter of debate. But his initial reports described the village that year as too quiet, too orderly, artificially cohesive, words that clashed with the neutral style he had used throughout his career. There were also indirect references to nighttime meetings on the hill, candles burning in the attic window, and a list of objects collected from residents who were never officially questioned. The turning point of this section emerges here. Among these papers, folded with extreme care, there was a final fragment signed by Elias Harrow. The ink almost faded. It read only, "They climbed to the attic of their own will, or because the village expected it of them." It was the first time a county employee suggested that the 17 missing individuals had not been victims of flight, accident, or crime, but of a silent, shared, never-confessed social expectation within Blackmarsh. And it is at this point, in this uncomfortable silence, that the mystery truly begins. Reconstructing daily life in Blackmarsh in the summer of 1876 reveals an image both clear and profoundly unsettling. The village, though simple and seemingly predictable, lived under a routine so rigid and silent that any deviation seemed to echo louder than it should. Elias Harrow's records describe the days as monochromatic, an unusual choice of word for a clerk accustomed to strictly functional terms. He noted the sound of wagons along the main street at 6 in the morning, the constant smell of wet wood from the sawmills, and the repetitive thud of fishermen's boots as they returned to the docks at day's end. It was a routine that, for decades, defined the identity of Blackmarsh. Among the older residents, there was an unspoken understanding that the village functioned best when everyone did exactly what had always been done. Communal discipline was almost a tradition passed from parent to child, and there was no room for public conflict or abrupt change. Perhaps that is why the disappearance of the 17 names was so carefully omitted. Order, even artificial order, was the ultimate priority. Every testimony recorded later, decades later, repeated the same sentence. In Blackmarsh, no one wanted to be the first to say something was wrong. Elias Harrow, living alone after the premature death of his wife, was a keen observer of this dynamic. In his personal notes, the ones unearthed 90 years later, he described how the village's emotional climate began to shift as early as April that year. Residents once known for their cordiality began avoiding certain hours of the day. Entire families held half-whispered conversations, always glancing over their shoulders. There was a sense of mutual vigilance, but no clear source. And at the center of this organized silence stood the house of Margaret Ellery, raised on the hill, seemingly playing a role that was never formally recorded. The widow was seen as respectable but distant. Reports state she rarely went down to the central square and interacted only occasionally through small exchanges of goods or brief conversations with older neighbors. Yet later records claim that some people, especially younger ones, were seen climbing the hill to speak with her, always at dusk, always alone, always returning in silence. There is no documentary confirmation of this, but the recurrence of the testimony suggests Margaret Ellery exercised some kind of moral, social, or emotional influence over certain residents. The attic, once a mere storage space, began appearing in accounts as a place where serious decisions were made, decisions that, according to unofficial reports, involved the idea of renunciation. The word renunciation appears only rarely in formal archives, but frequently in loose notes, personal messages, and even the margins of accounting books. It was not religious, legal, or financial renunciation. It was something more abstract, almost psychological. The term carried the weight of giving something up, a habit, a conflict, a guilt. At the time, Blackmarsh was experiencing economic changes that threatened its traditional structure. Travelers, traders, and transient workers passed through more frequently, bringing new ideas, new customs, and new restlessness that contrasted with the static lifestyle the community valued. The 17 who disappeared belonged to different groups: young farmers, 2 recent widows, 3 experienced fishermen, a newly arrived couple, and even a 13-year-old boy, son of a local mason. What did they have in common? Nothing obvious, except that, weeks before vanishing, all appeared to have faced subtle personal conflicts noted discreetly in the archives. Silent disputes between neighbors, family disagreements, doubts about leaving the village in search of work. Isolated personal storms that, taken together, formed an uncomfortable pattern. There is, for example, the case of Thomas Kearney, a 30-year-old farmer who began skipping community gatherings claiming fatigue, but who, according to neighbours, spent hours walking alone toward the widow Ellery's hill, or that of Nora Whitfield, a 47-year-old widow who kept her deceased husband's letters and who, in her final days, was seen giving small belongings to village children. Or young Ernest Hale, reprimanded by his father for speaking about leaving Blackmarsh. All of them, in different ways, showed signs of wanting to renounce something, though no one dared identify what. Elias, in his role as clerk, watched it all with growing unease. His reports show he perceived the connection but could not, or would not, describe it openly. He wrote phrases such as divergent behavior, prolonged silences, and expressions of collective discouragement, vague terms that later became key pieces of the reconstruction. He also seemed to be the only one who noticed that many of these residents made discreet visits to the hill in the weeks before the disappearance. Visits he noted only as unusual movement. In the last complete document before the event, dated July 17, 1876, Elias wrote, "The village awaits something no one names. The air is heavy, as if everyone bears a difficult decision that did not belong to them." It was the first time he subtly suggested that the residents were yielding to some kind of pressure, undeclared, unwritten, but perceptible in their collective behavior. Blackmarsh's daily life, therefore, was more than quiet. It was a fragile normality sustained by people trying to preserve a way of life while facing intimate conflicts. And as the village moved toward the day of the disappearance, subtle signs grew more frequent. Lights on late in houses that usually slept early, conversations cut short at the slightest noise, doors locked before sunset. That was the silent backdrop upon which the 17 residents vanished from the records, and what happened that night would forever be the hardest part to reconstruct. There was a silent consensus among the few surviving documents from 1876. The night of the disappearance did not begin as an extraordinary event. It settled over Blackmarsh gradually, almost imperceptibly, like so many summer nights when moisture gathered among the trees and the wind seemed out of caution to avoid crossing poorly sealed windows. But upon examining letters, marginal notes and testimonies gathered decades later, it becomes clear that the night carried a different density, as if every sound, every step, every flicker of light was perceived with unusual weight. The last official record left by Elias Harrow before the disappearance is marked 6:47 p.m. He noted the hour precisely, as always. Unusual movement on the northern path, candles lit in Mrs. Ellery's attic, 3 residents seen on the hill. It was the first time he openly mentioned people climbing toward the widow's house before dusk. He did not describe who they were, not because he didn't know, but because such identification seemed deliberately avoided. The choice of omission spoke louder than any detail. At 7:15 p.m., according to a late testimony from a fisherman named Rowan McHale, the village began to hear synchronized footsteps coming from the northern side. It was not a military march nor disordered movement. They were spaced, steady steps, as if each person followed the same internal rhythm, something neither taught nor planned. Rowan said he looked out the window and saw shadows moving along the hill path. 6 or 7 figures, walking without speaking, all in the same direction. He recognized only one, 13-year-old Ernest Hale, by the particular way the boy held his arms while walking. But, unlike other nights, the boy did not jump over stones, did not kick sticks, did not carry anything. He walked stiffly, gaze fixed ahead. Other testimonies collected many years later reinforced this image. A woman on Main Street reported seeing Nora Whitfield walking with a small candle in her hands, protected by a glass cup. Nora, who usually greeted everyone with a discreet smile, walked in complete silence that night without looking around. Farmer Thomas Kearney, who lived 3 houses away, was seen closing his gate before heading north, something he never did, as he always left it open until dawn. There were also reports of 2 fishermen walking side by side without exchanging a single word. Blackmarsh that night seemed to move with 2 rhythms, the Holmes quietly preparing supper, and the silent procession climbing the hill, responding to a call written nowhere. Around 8:10 p.m., According to local weather records, a low mist began forming over the valley. It wasn't dense enough to obscure vision completely, but it diffused the light, the type of mist that makes shadows seem closer than they really are. In that context, the attic of the widow Ellery's house became a focal point in testimonies. The narrow window facing the village showed a constant glow, as if multiple candles were burning inside. Some residents claimed to have seen slow movements behind the glass, silhouettes approaching and receding, though with no details to identify anyone. Meanwhile, in the center of the village, Elias remained in his office, reviewing documents he had likely analyzed dozens of times. His notebooks show that he noticed the movement on the hill long before deciding to act. He wrote, "If it continues like this, there will be more gaps than names." This sentence, found nearly a century later inside folded death records, suggests Elias understood that the disappearance would not be accidental. He hesitated, and that hesitation echoes through the documents that survive. At 9:02 p.m., he finally left the office. The note marking the hour appears on a loose, urgent slip. Going to the hill, too many lights, too much silence. He walked through Main Street, crossing the docks and the square, watching residents lock doors, some extinguishing lamps earlier than usual. The sense of withdrawal was almost absolute. With each step, the night breeze seemed to weaken, as if even the wind hesitated to accompany the clerk. The path to the hill was narrow and uneven, bordered by low fences and patches of tall grass. According to later fragments of his journal, Elias stopped several times trying to identify how many people had passed through earlier. There were recent tracks, boot marks, and small ends of used candles. He wrote, 17, at least 17. This is the only time the number appears so explicitly before the next morning's official entry. Halfway up, he heard something he described as restrained breathing coming from the edge of the path. He called softly, but no one replied. Some historians believe he encountered one of the residents who abandoned the ascent, someone who preferred to hide. But there is no confirmation, only speculation based on this solitary note. What is certain is that Elias continued upward alone. By 9:34 p.m., mist covered the base of the hill. The widow Ellery's house, viewed from below, seemed larger than it truly was. The attic light remained on, brighter now, flickering. As Elias approached, he perceived something he would describe years later in an unsent letter. The candles did not flicker as they should. The light shifted only when footsteps moved. At the door, he found it slightly ajar. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, only a suffocating silence. The sitting room was empty, the hallway dark, but the sound he described, a soft dragging from above, made it clear someone was in the attic. Elias climbed the stairs slowly, trying to steady his breath. The air inside was warm, filled with the smell of aged wood. Each step creaked, but the sound was swallowed by the strange acoustics of the house. Near the attic door, the light grew stronger but still soft, as if filtered through fabric. He paused before the door. There is no record of how long he stood there. The only note from that moment, written years later, reads, "I knew that if I opened it, I would find only absence." And yet he opened it. The final sentence of this section comes exactly from that note, found nearly a century later at the bottom of a box of personal papers. The attic was empty, not for lack of people, but for lack of return. Dawn on July 18, 1876, was described by many residents as a colorless dawn. The sun rose pale, veiled by a thin layer of fog that resisted the heat. The bell in the central square, which normally rang at 6 sharp, remained silent. And when Elias descended the hill after discovering the empty attic, there was something in his steps unseen in any other county record: hesitation. Elias was the first to officially record the absence of the 17 residents. At 7:12 a.m., he wrote in the county's main book, 17 residents did not report to their routines. Houses closed. Minimal belongings. Signs of calm departure, not forced. The phrase, calm departure, sparked debate among historians for decades, as it implied no struggle, no haste, no coercion, and at the same time, no explanation. When local authorities, the 2 deputy sheriffs and 3 community guards, went to the widow Ellery's house, they found Margaret sitting in a chair in the kitchen. She looked exhausted, but not frightened. According to the guard's report, she repeated the same sentence 3 times. No one was forced into anything. When asked what happened in the attic, Margaret looked at the window, clasped her hands on her lap, and replied, "They wanted silence, and this was the only place they could find it." That sentence alone would become the core of the mystery that survived the years. The guards found the attic just as Elias had described: extinguished candles with traces of warm wax, a wooden bench out of place, 2 windows slightly open, shoe marks near the west wall, and at the center of the room, a small irregular circle of shifted dust, as if something had been placed or removed there. No blood, no struggle, no broken objects. It was an attic too tidy for chaotic flight, too organized for violence. The residents' houses were inspected throughout the day. The pattern repeated: doors locked from the inside, candles extinguished carefully, belongings left in orderly fashion. Only minimal items were missing: simple clothes, provisions for a day or 2, loose notes, and in some cases, sentimental objects like a hand-stitched scarf or a small box of old letters. There were no farewell messages, but there was the strange sense that each of them had prepared to leave without expectation of immediate return or explanation. The community reacted as small villages do when faced with the inexplicable, with rumors, fear, and even stricter discipline. That afternoon, no one spoke loudly. Children stayed indoors. Carts did not circulate. Even the river seemed muted, as if Blackmarsh had collectively decided not to make any sound that could attract questions. During the informal investigation, for there was no structure for an official one, small clues arose, never fully connecting, yet suggesting something larger. Rowan McHale, the fisherman who had seen the silhouettes ascending, said he heard a male voice inside the widow's house that night, though he could not identify words. A woman named Abigail Sutter claimed she smelled burning candles long after midnight, though everyone had already retired. And an old farmer insisted for years that he saw 3 figures walking eastward at dawn with light bags, heading into the forest, though no trace of them was ever found. The more they investigated, the more ambiguities emerged. Some believed the 17 had voluntarily gathered to leave Blackmarsh and start anew elsewhere, tired of the village's internal pressures. Others believed the widow Ellery had convinced, not forced, them to renounce their conflicts, guilt, and emotional debts, and that this renunciation required a clean exit, a disappearance marking a final break with the past. And still others, writing decades later, suggested a more melancholic hypothesis, that the 17 did not leave together. They left separately, each overwhelmed by the suffocating sense that staying in Blackmarsh cost more than leaving. This last idea, though impossible to prove, appears in at least 3 academic articles on the case, all based on a single note by Elias. They did not want to be found. Not together, not apart, not by anyone. In the end, the only official conclusion written in county records was unresolved collective disappearance. But the villagers knew the phrase did not capture the emotional truth of the event. For weeks, no public conversation addressed what had occurred. There was an implicit pact of silence, as if discussing the disappearance would disrespect the choice, voluntary or not, of those who left. Margaret Ellery continued living in the same house, but permanently closed off the attic staircase. She never lit candles there again. She never received visitors at dusk. Her name appeared only twice more in county records, both brief and lacking detail. When she died in 1889, she left behind only a wooden box with personal objects, none linked to the disappearance. The emotional impact of the event, however, spread more deeply than the records suggest. Many families moved away in the following years, fearing that Blackmarsh's silence hid something even greater. Others stayed, perhaps out of resignation, perhaps for lack of alternatives. But in nearly every house, the same phrase began appearing, written on doors, windows, or personal notebooks: "Let no one renounce again." It was as if the village understood that if the renunciation of the 17 had been a human act, it had left wounds too deep to repeat. The most important revelation, however, surfaced 93 years later. The letter from Elias Harrow, found in 1969 hidden among old bindings in the municipal archive. An unsent, unpublished letter, written in trembling handwriting, and in it the sentence that would forever change the interpretation of the case. They did not disappear from us. It was we who failed to reach them. The Blackmarsh archives, now stored in a narrow basement room of the county administrative building, carry the characteristic smell of old wood, fine dust, and persistent dampness. Anyone consulting them must descend an iron staircase that creaks under its own weight, as if the building itself reminded at each step that the past demands silence. There, among uneven shelves, rest the notes of Elias Harrow, and there, more than a century later, this case still seems to breathe. The letter found in 1969, folded inside an unaddressed envelope, was the last piece added to the collection. The historian who discovered it, a retired professor of colonial history, said that opening the paper felt like watching the last breath of a memory refusing to die. The ink was nearly rust-colored, but still legible, and the words, though written for no one, felt directed at all of us. Writing is not saving. It is only preventing forgetfulness from winning too quickly. This idea accompanies anyone who revisits the disappearance of the 17 residents. The case is not merely a sum of gaps, but a portrait of the human difficulty in understanding what hides within shared silences. What occurred on that night in 1876 cannot be restored in detail. Time consumed the witnesses, erased nuances, dissolved intentions. Only fragments remain, and in each of them, the subtle impression that the people of Blackmarsh lived under a weight they did not know how to name. Through the documents, we see that the renunciation so often mentioned was not a formal pact nor a doctrine. It was a human tendency to gradually abandon what one can no longer carry. Guilt, emotional debt, unfulfilled promises, or simply the suffocating expectation of a community that demanded silence above all else. The 17 disappeared, but the village also renounced something that day, the illusion that it could remain as it always had been, untouched, impenetrable, protected from change. Walking the hill today, nothing remains of the widow Ellery's house besides warped boards and foundation traces covered in moss. The attic that once served as the stage for mysteries and silent decisions has been consumed by vegetation. The wind blows through the trees as if sweeping away the fragments of stories that were never told. And the village, once sustained by rigid routine, is now little more than a forgotten point on the map, inhabited by a few families and remembered only by scholars and distant descendants. What remains alive is the sense that Blackmarsh did not witness merely a collective disappearance, but a moment when different lives touched an invisible threshold. Each resident who climbed the hill that night carried something unwritten, an internal conflict, a profound exhaustion, a desire for silence. And because we lack access to their personal stories, we are forced to reconstruct the event through fragments, words, and gestures that survived by chance. It is here that the figure of Elias Harrow becomes central. He was an imperfect witness, but a conscious one, spectator of an event he never fully understood, but felt deeply. His notes reveal not only facts, but emotions. They reveal the anguish of someone who perceived that the careful order he kept in the books could not contain what moved silently within the village. They reveal the guilt of someone who saw too much and said too little. Above all, they reveal the fear that recording would not be enough to preserve. And yet he recorded. Decades later, reading his final letter, we understand that the disappearance belongs not only to those who left, but also to those who remained. The community of Blackmarsh never fully recovered. Entire families left the region. Others stayed but avoided mentioning the year 1876 aloud. And the descendants of the disappeared carried for generations the weight of a void that was not theirs, yet shaped their lives. Today, the case is not studied as a criminal event, nor as a communal rite. It is examined as a portrait of human fragility before the invisible pressures of everyday life. Renunciation, understood now not as a single act, but as a sum of silent decisions, shows how individuals can drift away from themselves long before disappearing physically. Thus, the story of the 17 is not only about absence, it is about the exact moment each of them realized that staying cost more than leaving. It is about how silence can sometimes be a form of protection, and how that protection can, over time, become an irrecoverable distance. In the end, when we close the books, blow dust off the pages and return the papers to their boxes, only one question remains. The same one Elias left echoing in the final paragraph of his letter. How many times does a person disappear before they cease to be among us? And upon reading that sentence, there is no music, no answer, no easy conclusion. There is only silence, the same silence that enveloped Blackmarsh on that night in 1876, and that still lingers, intact, between the lines of the records that survived time.